Welcome to XYPN Radio, where your host Alan Moore brings you into a community of fee-only financial planners who want to profitably and successfully serve Gen X and Gen Y clients. If you're ready to get the knowledge you need from leaders in your field, learn from forward-thinking advisors, and take action on your own goals, XYPN Radio is the show for you. Here's your host.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of XYPN Radio. I'm your host, Alan Moore, and today I'm excited to bring you an interview with Cady North, the founder of North Financial Advisors, a fee-only firm based in the downtown DC area. Cady, like most of our guests, didn't start her career in financial planning. In fact, she was a political science major that worked for the state of Texas and then ended up moving to DC to help coordinate on behalf of the Texas Department of Transportation. She went on to work at a trade organization and was the leading expert on the Dodd-Frank bill as it was being written. And her job was to liaison between the politicians and business owners that would be affected by the bill. She ended up making a career shift into writing for Bloomberg, at which time she actually got her MBA from Georgetown, and ultimately decided to make the leap into owning her own financial planning firm. She's a year into running her business and is doing a rock star job. I'll say that she avoided a common misstep by new owners, which is to underprice their service. So I think she's priced appropriately, and she's been able to build a client base that is paying her for the value of her services, which I think is a huge win. Towards the end of the episode, you'll hear us talk about how she's landing 1 to 2 speaking engagements per month to groups of ideal clients, and how she hopes to increase her paid speaking engagements in 2017. You can find any of the additional resources that we mentioned during the episode at xyplanningnetwork.com/79. In addition to the typical resources, you'll find a link to our recently launched book, co-authored by Kitsis and myself, titled The Monthly Retainer Model: What It Is, Why It Works, and How to Implement It in Your Firm. This month's episodes are brought to you by Financial Planners Assistance, providing compliance services to financial planners and other investment advisors since 1982. Financial Planners Assistance is a boutique consulting firm that provides the personalized compliance services firms are looking for. I actually personally worked with Financial Planners Assistance when launching my firm back in 2012, and I cannot say enough great things about their team and Jim Cullen, the owner. The awesome service and support I received was unparalleled, including going through an audit by the state of Wisconsin. Check them out at financialplannersassistance.com. Also, be sure to go to xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP to join our private group just for XYPN radio listeners. You can interact with other listeners, ask guest questions, and more. Without further ado, here is my interview with Cady. Hey, Cady, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for being on.
Thanks, Alan. It's my pleasure.
So we had several XYPN members. When I asked them, which other members would you like to hear on the podcast? Your name came up a couple of times. So I was excited to be able to make this schedule work, especially given the fact that you have been in DC, which means that you've been dealing with election stuff for the last couple of months, which sounds terrible, honestly. Has life sort of calmed down in the DC area?
It's starting to, definitely. It definitely sucks out a lot of the energy in the room when that's pretty much the focus for 90% of the jobs around here is, politically related. So
I lived in Wisconsin during the 2012 leading up to the 2012 presidential election. And, it's a swing state. And so that was the first time I'd ever witnessed, what hundreds of millions of dollars in ads to like. I can say I was very thrilled to not be in a swing state this year. No one spends any money in Montana or Tennessee. So it's a good thing. So enough of politics. As usual, kind of want to take us back and tell me a little bit about kind of how your career in financial planning has developed. So did you kind of get your degree in financial planning and start in this industry, or did you start somewhere else?
No, I actually have a liberal arts degree in my undergrad. I went to school at the University of Texas and studied political science and government. And in part, that was motivated by the fact that I became financially independent at a pretty young age. I was maybe 17, and I had to fund my own college education. I was sort of on my own, and I had to find full-time work while I was going to school. And I happened to get a job with the former Texas Speaker of the House. And so from a very young age was involved in sort of state politics and thought that it would be really interesting to also study, political science for my undergraduate degree. And that turned out to work pretty well for me, and, was able to take some pretty interesting jobs right out of school, working for the state of Texas, which eventually brought me to the DC area around 2007.
So a really good time to be in DC, as everything, I guess, every 4 years gets upheavaled when it comes to politics. So everyone seems to be very anti-liberal arts, and I understand why that is, that it's not as clear of a direction. But I'm assuming what you learned in school has obviously contributed to your career path and skill set as you've sort of developed into, the direction you've gone.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think a liberal arts degree is excellent for giving you a taste of a lot of different areas. And in particular, the focus on writing and communicating very clearly helps across a broad range of types of work. And so for somebody who's enterprising, which is somebody like me, actually, and very clear about, trying to seek out new opportunities and go look for potential work, it was a great thing for me. And, what I ended up doing coming to DC in 2007 was working for the State Federal Relations Office and sort of becoming the head advocate on behalf of Texas to talk about, transportation policy and financing the state's infrastructure and getting into all sorts of different kind of financial strategies the state was using, because Texas is one of the largest states, and certainly from an infrastructure perspective, it's huge. So working on that budgetary process at the federal level was really interesting. And when the assignment was sort of over, so to speak, I decided that I wanted to stick around DC. I liked it a lot more than I expected. Coming from a state like Texas, we're very proud and we take a lot of pride in our state. And I thought for sure I'd immediately get back home, right? But it turns out, almost 10 years later, I'm still here. I've taken on a number of different roles, primarily in sort of this government affairs sector, which is very unique to DC. You don't hear about that much outside of DC, but working on advocacy campaigns, essentially to help businesses, to help consumers get their voice and their message heard on Capitol Hill. And, shortly after taking a job with a trade association called Financial Executives International was when the financial crisis sort of broke out. And, at that time I was working with C-suite level executives from around the country as early drafts from Paul Volcker and the Treasury Department were making their rounds of what would eventually become the Dodd-Frank law that was passed in 2010. Worked on that from the perspective of being a translator between the business community to Congress and then vice versa, explaining to the business community sort of, what Congress was doing, how long this was going to take, what sorts of iterations it would take. And then, helping people understand more about how businesses utilize things like hedging strategies or, how privately held companies need to worry about estate tax laws, those kinds of things.
That is fascinating work because it's such a hidden thing, I guess, that, most of us just see Dodd-Frank and we see the end result and we can complain about it or we can love it or whatnot and rip it apart. But to actually be involved in the process of creating it and kind of and translating, I guess, between the two organizations is huge. What was that process like? Was it a pretty negative process, I guess, considering you were working with the executives, or was it, something that they were looking for? Just curious.
In some parts, it was things that they were looking for. And in some parts, it was trying to get changes to initial proposals. So an example of that was before we started our work on the bill, nobody knew what sort of an end user of derivatives looked like. So, hedging strategies, futures, forwards, those kinds of things. Nobody knew that, an energy company or a manufacturing company would actually be involved as a counterparty to one of those transactions. They just assumed it was all banks, all horrible, all these, bundled things that caused the blow up of the financial economy, right? And actually that wasn't the case. So a lot of our job was educating members of Congress not to take this out of the bill itself, but to really provide specific provisions around hedging and business owners who are involved in this process and utilizing these products in a very safe way that helps companies grow.
It's a really interesting point because people that hedge and derivatives and that sort of thing, futures contracts are all regarded as this like evil thing that people do to try to tank the economy. And that's really not what they are. And I think most financial planners know that, but it's a fair point that most politicians are hearing. They're not necessarily talking to the financial planners. So that is really interesting. So are you still involved with that at all, with the fact that there have been some comments made about Dodd-Frank possibly being rolled back and that sort of thing? Are you still in that world at all to kind of know what the conversations are on that sort of thing?
I'm definitely, monitoring it and evaluating it, but working the congressional process is a very frustrating process. A lot of the work that you do in that field tends to be frustrating because your success or failure depends on what Congress does or doesn't do. And that's a hard place to be because Congress either doesn't do a whole lot or they do stuff that a lot of people disagree with. And so you tend to feel like you're not ever making progress being involved as sort of a lobbyist or an advocate on that kind of process. So I made a decision after doing that, after Dodd-Frank had actually passed, to go move more into the financial journalism route. And I took a job with Bloomberg where I was an analyst that actually wrote research for the Bloomberg terminal and other web-based properties that Bloomberg owns, to be more of a microphone or sort of this translator with a broader audience, so to speak, to be able to explain to people what was happening rather than to try to influence it or to, work on behalf of, the large Fortune 500 companies anymore.
That makes sense. So more external than internal, but probably still had a lot of influence, in being a vocal advocate and educating consumers, because that's where a lot of the complaints come from, are from uneducated consumers that are out there, and pushing politicians to do different things. So I guess, how was that role at Bloomberg? I don't think I've ever met anybody that actually worked at Bloomberg. So
yeah, I mean, it was definitely interesting playing that role because it was sort of a new space for Bloomberg to get involved in the government aspect of things and sort of communicating government policy and its impact on business and consumers. And so I was sort of at the forefront of that. And I don't know that I love this nickname about me, but I sort of became known as the Queen of Dodd-Frank internally and with a lot of different groups around town. And it was just because I was always writing something at least once a week, looking at how, payments were going to change, ACH payments or debit card payments were going to change under Dodd-Frank, reviewing the changes to the insurance industry and how this new federal office of insurance was going to come in and try to create new regulatory changes at the federal level, whereas traditionally insurance products are regulated at the state level. So, what does all that stuff sort of mean and how is it going to impact business and consumers? And so that was definitely a really interesting way for my career to evolve. And I got to do a lot of fun things along the way. One of the things that I got to do later on was at an RIA conference in Vegas one year. I actually got to be the primary interviewer on stage for Chris Dodd and Barney Frank.
Wow.
Post-crisis and post-Dodd-Frank, and talk to them, for in an audience of 800 or 1,000 people about, what they see the impacts are being. And so that was really interesting as well.
I wonder, I'm assuming you knew more about the Dodd-Frank Act than they did at that point from all the analysis that you had done. So probably interesting being interviewed by you. I'm curious, were they happy with the results? I mean, obviously their name's on it, but there's always give and take whenever you're getting laws passed. So were they happy with where things ended up?
Oh, certainly. There's always give and take, but I think they were pleased with the ultimate outcome, and were more focused at that time on looking forward to the regulatory rule writing process, which, is the bulk of what it means to have teeth for regulation, right? I mean, Congress can write the laws, but it's essentially a skeleton. Just like we're seeing with the DOL fiduciary rule, you can have something on paper that Congress has written into law, but it doesn't really mean anything until you have regulations and Q&A documents written by the individual agencies to implement it.
Yeah, and that sounds like the world's worst job. Maybe not the world's worst, but it's got to be top 5 for me. I've always wondered who actually writes all of those Q&A documents, because that just sounds terrible. I assume they have an army of lawyers and people like yourself doing that type of work. So
they do, and it is very tedious. And it's not fun to read all the time either, but you have to go through and read these 400, 800-page documents and try to make heads or tails of what's going on, because it's really important,
No, it absolutely is. I am thrilled that there are people out there that are willing to, and that are good at it, and that are willing to take those types of roles on. But so I guess, how did the job at Bloomberg then evolve?
Sure. So, I actually went back to school and got my MBA at Georgetown while I was working full time. And I started exploring through some of the sort of residencies and different projects that I worked on, a lot more personal finance related topics. And financial literacy had always been something that was a huge interest to me. I think at some point, around the financial crisis, I started blogging and doing a little bit of financial literacy type work on the side. And then I got busy and stopped doing it. But I also always would come back to writing out goals for myself and my career. And somewhere on that goals page would be something about financial literacy. Either I wanted to do public speaking in the field or media work in the field to try to enhance people's understanding of financial literacy, because I just happened to learn this stuff mostly on my own. And in part, by some of my like early upbringing working on my family's small business, was sort of self-taught as it relates to personal finance. And I was always very puzzled why people didn't get it. But it made me realize that none of this stuff is ever taught in school. And you can be someone who is highly educated and very successful in your career, but have virtually no clue about your own personal finances and make mistakes, maybe not to a degree that, they're horrible, horrible mistakes, but you just miss out on so many potential opportunities that you have working with somebody like a financial planner who can help you set goals and take a look at your finances more comprehensively and come up with like plans that help you work through this stuff. So in doing some of this work through my MBA, I started researching kind of what was possible for me post MBA and thinking about my career. And I think I, happened upon some Michael Kitz's articles. One of the books that was recommended on his blog was So You Want to Be a Financial Advisor? And I picked that book up and was just super excited about the fact that, this was actually a business that I could do now instead of having to wait till some point in the undetermined future to work on this goal I had of becoming like a spokesperson or a media person in the financial literacy field. So I was just super intrigued by it and decided, after I finished my MBA, that I would leave Bloomberg and just sort of make the leap and start my firm.
Oh, I love it. Okay, so a couple of things I want to dig into. So first off, the book that you mentioned, So You Want to Be a Financial Planner, it's by Nancy Jones. I've recommended it to folks. Is it a book that you recommend for folks that are interested in financial planning?
Absolutely. I love that it's just a bunch of different case studies, one after another. And so you get a taste for smaller firms and larger firms, and it's quite diverse in terms of men and women, and which is not always the case when you read about the financial planning world. And so I really loved it. I thought it was a great resource because it had different tools and worksheets and unlimited numbers of people to reach out to as far as who you could ask questions. And that sort of spurred me to do some of my own research locally and get in touch with some fee-only financial planners that are based in the DC area to do some additional research and talk to them about how they started their firms.
So we'll put a link to the book in the show notes, but you can get it on Amazon. I just pulled it up. There's a Kindle version for $35 or paperback for $55. Highly recommend this book. We actually have a review of the book on our blog just because we're huge supporters, and I believe Kitsis actually wrote the foreword for the most recent edition. But so I do want to circle back on one thing that you mentioned, though, and that was a family business. Did you grow up working in a family business?
I did. We grew up in a small coastal community in Texas called Rockport. And it was essentially fishing and tourism were the primary two industries. So my parents actually owned a little motel that was sort of like cottages for short-term and long-term rentals. And growing up there, I had to take on roles from everything from cleaning bathrooms to, trying to clean the pool, keep the pool clean, right? And it was around the age of maybe 12 or 13 when my dad asked if I wanted to start helping out with some of the bookkeeping, because we had gotten, our first computer and we were looking at electronic billing and not billing, but looking at electronic record keeping and things like that. Mm-hmm. And so he sort of said, well, do you want to take this on and start learning about all of this and doing some bookkeeping for the business? And, I don't know, I'm 13 years old, but I was like, yeah, sure, I'll do this. They were going to pay me something like $5 or $6 an hour. So, I started doing that and found it to be, I guess, maybe somewhat tedious, but also interesting because I could see the cost of things, the utility bill for a hotel, right? Looking at, linen services and telephone services and all the pricing that goes into small businesses, right? And so once I got good with that and pretty proficient, my dad actually had me start writing out checks and, doing everything but essentially signing the check. And that was a lot of responsibility when I look back on it for somebody who's like 13 years old. But, I think that gave me, whether I knew it or not, a foundation for, some financial literacy that allowed me to be much more curious about those aspects of personal finance than maybe someone who didn't have an experience like that.
Yeah, there's a great book called The Opposite of Spoiled, and it's Ron Lieber, who's one of the editors at the New York Times, and he kind of advocates for the same thing more in the personal world, not necessarily for folks that have a small business, but it's a great point as well. And that's have kids involved in the process of money, for managing the household finances, because it's amazing what you can learn just by seeing what things cost. I've just kind of was always amazed that, kids would graduate college and have no idea what a rent costs and how that is reflected in the budget, and the fact that $40,000 income isn't really a $40,000 income because you have to pay taxes. It's more like $33,000 and things like that. So absolutely huge. And so do you feel like that has been beneficial, I guess, in terms of as you've kind of gone on to run your own business to have had that background?
Yeah, it is. And it taught me a lot about the things that I don't want to do as a small business owner, as much as it taught me about the things that I want to do as a small business owner. I saw my parents really struggle to find balance with their personal life and their business life, always having been self-employed. And for a long time, I think the reason why I pursued a career for over a decade in the corporate world was because I saw that, frustrating aspect of their lives and was like, I don't think I want to be a small business owner myself. This is a lot of work. But, eventually, and in part, I think the MBA helped me think through some of this. I like the idea of more independence and more flexibility. And I know that through good business planning and through, by talking to people and relying on support from, different networks and things, that you can actually achieve a lot more balance in your life than, maybe definitely than my parents probably could have, but maybe other types of businesses in the past as well. We have access to the gig economy. We can, share office space with other people. We don't have to have somebody answer our phones for us. There's all sorts of things that allow us to be a lot more flexible, both on a location basis, as well as sort of when and how we work, that are really beneficial to small business owners today.
It is a very good point that I'm glad we got to start businesses in 2016 instead of, 1996 for the exact thing that you're talking about. That, I was able to get Ruby receptionists for $200 a month to answer my phones instead of paying a full-time receptionist, which I would have had to have done 10, 15, 20 years ago. To do pretty much any task, you had to hire full-time people to come in and do it.
Right.
I am curious, so you watched your parents struggle with kind of this work-life balance or work-life harmony, which is becoming the new term to say. And this is something I think we all struggle with. I personally struggle with it for sure in how to balance family and personal time and work, because work becomes life when you own a business. What are your strategies for maintaining balance as you continue to build a business and, have the tendency that it can be all-consuming?
Yeah, I think my strategies are constantly evolving. I'm not a huge fan of to-do lists, and I used to love to-do lists. It was my favorite thing in the world to be able to mark things off to-do lists. But since I've become a business owner, I find that they're a huge problem for me because they're never done.
It's a never-ending list.
Yeah, so I just stopped sort of setting myself up for failure from that perspective, and I just utilize my calendar primarily as a way to keep me focused. So I sort of put time in my calendar specifically to focus on a task. And then if it requires, multiple sessions of that, I just add multiple sessions in my calendar. And it works as a way to create a deadline for myself, somewhat artificially, but it also allows me to just have focused time to worry about something rather than continuously rolling through this long list of things that I have to do in my head. But it's still a struggle, right? I think I spent the first 6 months in business kind of running myself ragged, trying to figure out, my website and pull things together. I was working till 1 a.m. sometimes. And I said, this is not what I signed up for. This is not the kind of life that I wanted to create for myself. So what I looked at was, what am I spending time on doesn't have any ROI? And I felt like I had to do it all, right? I had to make the website beautiful. I had to call 10 people a week to try and get public speaking engagements. I had to reach out to clients. I had to write a blog post every single week. That was a lot to handle for one person, and it was somewhat unrealistic. So I started systematically going through and looking at where I was spending my time to see, okay, what is giving me immediate results in terms of clients, and what is maybe a more long-term kind of thing that I can work on as a side project on a broader range of time to try to, make sure I have more balance in my day. And that has served me much better, kind of looking at it from that perspective. And this whole idea of time boxing in my calendar has been great too.
I think those are some invaluable tips. So time boxing is huge. There's a theory, I think, called Parkinson's Law. And it basically states that a task will take as much time as we allot them. We can all remember that paper that we were writing in college when we said, oh, we have 3 days to do this. No big deal. What did we do? We waited until the last hour to get it done. Or if you just waited the last hour, you just took an hour to get it done. So that's kind of that plays into this time boxing concept. I do that personally where I put, exercise and date nights and time with my son and things like that. I'm not very good at doing it for individual tasks. Do you have a system for it beyond just kind of Google Calendar, or is that really the way that you're managing that?
No, it's really just Google Calendar. I sort of estimate when I know, say I have to do a financial plan and it's due by whatever date. I know that it's probably going to take me a couple of different sessions working on it. And so I sort of estimate my time up front as to what I want to work on. And then I might get kind of specific, like I'm going to work on the insurance analysis here in this hour. I'm going to do, retirement planning in these next hours, that sort of a thing. But a lot of times I don't even get that specific. I just say, working on so-and-so's financial plan for this time box. But, what you said about exercising and social stuff, absolutely, I do the same thing. I mean, I think that's the only way to make sure that I get it in my day is to plan it out and to have a set time in my calendar. And as a solo entrepreneur, it's important to have that, outreach time and to plan for social as well as like client related discussions. So that's a big part of my focus for planning my week is I almost look at my time as a week by week basis rather than an individual day or an individual hour. I almost take a look and make sure, okay, how many, social coffees or lunches do I have? How many networking events? How many of these are client-based events? How many of these are my own personal, workout time or self-care time? And try to look at it to try to find balance on a weekly basis.
And I think that is huge because as entrepreneurs, again, that to-do list is forever long. You make a really good point with that because there's always something else we could be doing because in the event that our to-do list is done, there's always marketing, right? Like we can always be doing something. And I see all too often new entrepreneurs not taking care of themselves. It physically as well as their mental health. And that comes in a couple folds. One is doing some sort of exercise, whatever that is for you, but also giving yourself some brain space. I personally really struggle if I'm just mired in the day to day. I cannot free up brain space for creative thinking. And anytime I kind of go through this process of consolidating and delegating things off, handing off tasks, that sort of thing, and get to the point where I'm like, you almost free up some brain space. It's usually good when I'm skiing. Like that's when I actually come up with some of the best ideas and can actually implement them in the things that are working for the business. So I love your recommendations. I think those are huge. So one more thing before we jump into sort of the structure of your firm was you mentioned that you went to Georgetown to get your MBA. And this is a question that I get from a lot of listeners is whether or not an MBA is valuable. Is it useful? What school to go to? So can you tell me a little bit about your thought process of why go get an MBA? And because it wasn't like you needed something to do, right? You were working full time. So you had plenty going on. So why get your MBA? Why Georgetown? And do you think it has served you well?
Yeah, so I wanted to get an MBA. I had been wanting to get an MBA for many, many years. And I was always struggling with the ROI concept of, am I actually going to make something of myself more than if I had just kept working and kept connecting with people in my network and, continued moving through my career path. And for a long time, the answer was no, I don't see where that ROI is because an MBA is very expensive.
Yes, it is.
And the reason why is because if you're going to go in, unless you're going to go into a field like consulting or M&A or investment banking, the ROI is going to take a really long time. But while I was at Bloomberg, they actually offered to pay for my MBA. And so that changed the calculus quite a bit. Is to find the ROI, to take what you can out of the MBA experience from a networking perspective, from a skills perspective, from a working in large groups and small groups in a very close way. There's all sorts of skills that come out of that. And then to have a company sponsor me was extremely helpful and valuable from that perspective. As far as financial planning training, there isn't a lot in most MBA curriculum, and that may not be the case for all. I think there are a few business schools that are starting to offer some form of more financial planning related type stuff. But other than a basic wealth management class and general corporate finance, which covers things like time value of money, which is really useful, and things like that. The MBA itself didn't necessarily prepare me to take like the CFP exam at all. It did give me a lot of skills though, in terms of critical thinking about how to design business strategies, not only for myself, but to help others do that too. And to think through critical decisions that you have to make around funding, around kind of market testing your idea and getting it proven before you even invest 1 cent in a business. We did a business planning residency modeled after the lean startup method. And it was extremely, extremely helpful as I started my own business and did my own research. So that was
that is
great.
Definitely on my top 3 or 5 books that I recommend for new entrepreneurs is The Lean Startup. We'll link to it in the show notes. I'm only aware of a couple of MBA programs that you can get an MBA in personal financial planning. Georgia State used to have one. I'm not sure if they still do. They're not very common, but to your point, an MBA is more about how to run your business, not necessarily like CFP content and how to do financial planning, because you can get that with a certificate program. So you have found, it sounds like, the teachings from the MBA program valuable for someone who's out there looking at starting a business, or that's on their horizon in 3, 5, 10 years, whatever that goal timeframe is. Do you think the MBA, especially if they have to pay for it themselves, do you think it's worth that? I mean, if they don't have a company sponsoring them, how do you evaluate that ROI, for someone who is going to be coming out of pocket for it?
Well, I actually do a speech on this for people here in the DC area. And my argument is often that you can find a lot of these resources by talking to people. If you're clear enough on your want and what you want to do, people will just open doors for you just by asking for help. And so there's a lot of work that you can do outside of the educational, official academia to learn about things like the Lean Startup method and to do like business planning weekends, read different books, talk to a lot of different people. And, you would have as much skill if you take it seriously and you really work hard at it, as much skill as somebody who went through the MBA program. Now, the benefit of the MBA program, though, is that you're forced to do it, right? You have time set aside. Right. You're getting a grade. You have to do this in order to finish out the semester. And so if you're somebody who needs a bit more prompting from that perspective or a mental focus from that perspective, it might be better to get the MBA or to, do a component of an MBA, specifically in entrepreneurship or lean startup methodology.
Okay, that's fair. Like I said, I don't have my MBA, so I've never been through the program. I'm kind of watching from afar while our COO goes through an MBA program. And it's fascinating. And some of the work that he's doing and what he's learning is great. It's always this balance, like you said, of time and money and focus and all that sort of thing. And so it sounds like you probably, if you're self-starter enough, you can probably go, let's say, hack together an MBA level education without actually getting the letters. But there's something to be said for the professors at most of the MBA programs. And I'm assuming at Georgetown, the professors are probably phenomenal and have just a wealth of knowledge. So always a balancing act. So,
yeah.
Okay. So you get to the MBA program, you make the decision that you're going to start your own financial planning firm. Well, first off, how did that even come about? Like, I guess, how did that decision get made, considering you haven't worked in a financial planning firm up until this point?
Yeah. So, I was really thinking through how I could turn a business in around financial literacy into something worthwhile for me to do now. And I think a lot of the articles that Michael Kitces has written kind of helped me see that, for around $10,000, it's low startup, relatively a long but high potential profitability, long startup phase perhaps, but a higher potential profitability to do specific financial planning. And it's a product, right? It's less nebulous than this whole concept of just like working to advance financial literacy. And so I kind of glommed onto that specific kind of product focus of producing financial plans as a way to accelerate my dream into the now instead of, explaining to people that I wanted to be the next Susie Orman in like 15 years, right? That was sort of what I went through as my decision making. And, in talking to a lot of people too, other financial planners, it gave me a lot of focus and was able to help me crystallize how I should go about doing it and the types of things that I should focus time on, and how I can sort of slowly do this on my own rather than having to go through, a separate wealth management company and do time there. A lot of my frustration from that process was honestly, it's so heavily male dominated. that, and I want to, and I do work with women primarily. And so it was hard for me to find any financial planning firms in my area that were specifically focused on working with women. And I felt like I wouldn't get the experience I wanted anyway if I had gone that route versus starting my own firm.
Yeah, that is a really tough call. Kitsis and I disagree on this one. And you'll hear us sometimes talk about this, that, folks will come to me and they say, do I need experience doing financial planning to start a firm? And Kitsis's response is, yes, you need experience. And I mostly agree with it if you can find the right experience, right? And that's sort of what you ran into, is if I had shown you a 3-year apprenticeship residency style program with a firm that specialized in working with women, and you had a female advisor that would serve as your mentor and really show you the ropes and get you involved in the industry, you probably would have taken that opportunity, and that would have been extremely valuable. But it wasn't there. And it's the sad state of affairs right now in financial planning that we don't have more of those opportunities. I hope in 5 to 10 years we can listen back to this interview and go like, oh man, remember how bad it used to be? And we've really changed that. That is my own dream and vision. Okay, so you decide to start your own firm. Did you enroll in a CFP program at that point, or have you enrolled in a CFP program to date?
Yes. So almost immediately when I made the decision to start my firm, I started the online program to do the CFP coursework. Actually, I think I did the Series 65 before any of that. So I did the Series 65, took it and passed first try, and then immediately rolled over and started doing the CFP coursework. So it was like I was already in MBA mode and study mode. I might as well just keep this momentum rolling and work as quickly as possible to get through the online coursework for the CFP.
So were you still working at Bloomberg at this point when you're going through the CFP program?
No, I wasn't. I left Bloomberg. They prohibit people from working on other outside activities. So I wasn't in a position to do this, what I would have been a smarter thing, honestly, and, continue working at a full-time job while I was starting a business on the side.
Yeah, that is the dream for many of us, but not very many of us get that opportunity. Okay, so kind of you decide to launch your firm. What year, or kind of what's the time frame at this point that you're looking, or that you've enrolled in CFP program, you're starting your firm?
So I think I enrolled in the CFP program, joined the XY Planning Network, and then maybe 2 months later got my firm approvals and was officially launched. So I was working on the CFP coursework for another 3 to 4 months, and then sat for the exam last March.
Okay, so you launched, that puts you around December of
2015.
15? Is that?
Yeah.
December 2015. Okay, so you've officially been in business for basically a year.
Uh-huh.
Fantastic. Okay, so I guess, honestly, how's the process been? Like, we like to show the rainbows and unicorn side of financial planning and starting a business, but has it been that for you? Has it been, I don't know, I guess in your own words, what has this process been for you starting a business?
Well, there's definitely been a lot of ups and downs. We talk about taking care of ourselves from a financial perspective, from an emotional perspective. And so I've had definitely ups and downs from both of those categories. I've also already been through an audit by myself, which was really interesting and way longer process than I would have imagined. So that was also kind of a bit of frustration, having to go through that, 6 months after I got my initial approval. The audit took about 3 months, and the auditors weren't in my
months.
Yeah, they weren't in my firm for that entire time, but it was back and forth a lot around certain things in my ADV and also with my written procedures.
Gotcha. Yeah. And I have told this story before on the show, but when I got my first audit, it was 6 months into my business. So a lot of states, they come in 6 months after you've launched just to be sure you're doing things the way you need to be doing. And they were in my office for a half day and a couple follow-up emails, but that was it. Definitely not 3 months worth. So it's a frustrating piece because what you want to be doing is focusing on building your business, not answering questions about how you're running your business and prove that you're not doing anything shady. So how has client growth been? Like, where are you seeing success in the consumer space in getting clients engaged in your financial planning process?
Yeah. So initially, I think before I started my firm, I was very aggressive and I thought that I would be able to bring on 2 new clients a month. And that pretty quickly I found out was not realistic. And instead, I averaged bringing more like 1.5 clients on the balance throughout the year. And so once I kind of readjusted those expectations, I felt a lot better. But, there were a few months where all of a sudden I wasn't getting any phone calls and I didn't know what was wrong. I spent a lot of time talking to NAPFA advisors in the local area and was getting a lot of referrals, and that was fantastic. I had a few folks reach out to me friends-wise that helped get some initial clients on the books. But then eventually I was getting a lot of organic growth. The vast majority of people who find me have done a Google search either on the CFP board site or specifically finding a financial planner in Washington, D.C. And my name comes up because there's very few financial advisors that are actually based in like downtown DC. Many of them are out in Maryland or in Virginia. And so I tend to have this hyper local focus where people who live and work within about 10 minutes from where I live and work call me. And I actually really like that. I like the fact that people are finding me organically, and that's been great. And it tends to be the ideal client, which is someone who doesn't have millions of dollars, right? People who are just starting out, they've gotten their first job or their first very well-paying job, and they're trying to sort through things like picking their benefits and, sorting out how they plan for retirement and those kinds of things. But it's also a hard sell sometimes because financial planning is not cheap. And for a lot of people, spending money on the order of a couple $1,000s to do financial planning is still a bit of a heavy lift. So, I think in my first year, I just looked at my close rate as far as new business, and I think I'm at about 40%. And I don't know what the average benchmark is, but I feel like that's pretty decent. It does mean that 60% of the time I have people who tell me no, or what happens more often, they just don't respond. And that can be frustrating too.
What you'll find is that some of that 60% circles back around. You just have to be in business long enough for them to circle back. I was in a meeting one time where we had done the introduction meeting 7 years prior. And 7 years later, this gentleman called us back and said, okay, ready to get started. All right, maybe we should do another one of those intro meetings.
Right.
Or they'll refer business or whatnot. But yeah, we're hoping to do some sort of benchmarking survey. I hear 50% is the kind of that goal number. Anything higher than that, if you're up in the 75, 80%, then you're either working with too many people or probably not charging enough. So I guess that's a question for you is kind of what is your fee structure for a new client that's coming on board?
Yeah. So for an individual, I charge an upfront fee of $1,500. And then I have a monthly fee of $250, which kicks in about 60 days later after we produce the financial plan. And, for couples, it's a little bit different. I charge a higher upfront fee, but have the same monthly fee.
I will say you did not make the mistake of undercharging and underpricing yourself. Too often we see advisors, they'll say, oh, let's do $50 a month for a while. But not a lot of advisors have the confidence to come in and say, $1,500 upfront, $250 a month in their first year of business. So I would say, I would commend you for being willing to come in and do that, because if you had priced yourself at $100 a month, you probably would have brought on that 2 to 3 clients a month, and you'd have less revenue and twice as many clients. So right. That's not necessarily a bad thing. So
I think that I looked at it from a perspective as I want to provide as high touch financial planning services as I can. And in order to do that, I don't want to leave out certain aspects of this concept of comprehensive financial planning. In order to do that, I have to charge, what I charge. And if people can't afford that, then it just means that maybe we need to work on one specific area and do a mini financial planning session one time. And then, like you said, maybe they'll come back later and want to do something more comprehensive.
Absolutely. I do think that you have skipped a big part, which I think is a struggle for many new business owners, which is that initial pricing. And again, we tend to price ourselves too low because we want to learn, we want to get a few clients in the door and that sort of thing. But it really can have long-term negative ramifications to do that. And like you said, you have a client base where you're not looking at it going, crap, I got that $50 a month client and I've got to call them just as often as I call my $250 a month client. So I think that's a very good thing. Are you noticing any, similarities among your client base? Obviously, hyper local in the DC area, even, a 10-minute drive means they live like 2 blocks away from my experience in DC. So other than being hyper local, are you noticing a trend in terms of their profession or the types of services or complexities that they have in their personal kind of financial plan?
It's primarily women who are just getting started, having like this good job, good steady paying job that they but they're looking at the next steps, and they probably don't want to be chained to their same desk job forever and ever. And they're evaluating things like whether or not to go to business school or whether or not to go out on their own and start their own consulting company one day. And so those are the kinds of questions that I like tackling. And sort of one of my taglines for my business is dream big, because I feel like women have trouble with this sometimes, is dreaming really big for themselves and setting stretch goals for themselves. And so that's one of the things that I like doing with my clients most is, okay, so, if you didn't have to work anymore starting tomorrow, what would you do? And that tends to open this really interesting discussion for most of my clients because it gets them thinking outside the box. And so part of my goal is to get them thinking about that goal to a point where we can eventually make it happen. And it doesn't have to be this magical, never going to happen thing. We can actually plan financially for it. And so that's kind of the biggest question that I like working with on my clients. There's not necessarily a lot of homogeneity as far as what they do for a profession or, anything like that. But that's sort of where I'm at, is to try to get them to think through some of these larger term concepts and even, walk them through the setting up of a business, walk them through the concept of doing lean startup types of research, walk them through setting up their QuickBooks for the first time, that sort of thing too.
Isn't that stuff so much fun? Like I nerd out over this career planning and starting businesses and things like that. I kind of found the same thing. That ended up being my niche. And I'm as guilty as anybody. I started my firm working with individuals and families, right? So anyone that could breathe and show up to my office, I would work with them. But the kind of the same focus that you have is what I found was so much fun, was like, how do we help you start a business and get in there and help you with your QuickBooks and your marketing and things like that? Those were just fun conversations. Those excited me a lot more than, okay, I guess let's look at your retirement in 3 to 5 years, which is important. And they need an advisor. I wasn't the right advisor. Mm-hmm. So I guess kind of what are you looking at over the next 6, 12, 24 months? Like, where are things going from here? Are you anticipating any major changes, or are you pretty clear on your strategic plan and on that path for where you want to go?
Yeah, I don't anticipate making any major changes like in my ADV update this year. As far as pricing and that sort of thing, I think I'm pretty happy with it. What I am going to do is start working on more freemiums that specifically start targeting more of the entrepreneurial minded folks. I don't necessarily want to say that I target entrepreneurs, even though that's in like my Twitter handle and a few things, because I feel like a lot of people who are just getting started thinking through this don't even fancy themselves as entrepreneurs yet at all. And so saying that I target and work with entrepreneurs is not true, because I want to work with people 1 year, 2 years before they actually become entrepreneurs. And so my goal for 2017 is to kind of work on some freemium products that will go on the website to start looking at how to target more of these people and get them to have eyeballs on my website and that kind of thing. And then I also want to continue doing a lot of public speaking. I do about 2 public speaking engagements a month, and generally working with outside organizations who, have a focus on wanting to provide financial literacy to their members or provide, free services to the public, that kind of a thing. So I want to continue doing that for sure and try to expand it in some respects as well. And I have, a rotating list of different presentations that I give. One is how to become financially ready to start a business. And I get a lot of really great reception with that. And so I want to continue expanding on those kinds of collateral materials.
2 engagements a month. That's fantastic. I guess, how are you finding these engagements?
It takes quite a bit of time to find the right organizations, but generally what I find happens is it doesn't take much work to research what organizations you want to reach out to, but it does take a lot of work to follow up and get an initial someone to talk to on the phone so that you can pitch what you want to speak about. And that contributed to a lot of frustration, because initially anyway, because I was sort of hoping that I could just make cold calls and this would happen organically. But it turned out initially to take a lot more work as far as following up, and, non-response didn't mean no. In my case, I kept pushing, and that worked out well. And so I found a couple of different organizations, General Assembly being one, Knowledge Commons DC is another good one, where they asked me to come back and do other presentations. So once I established the relationship, then every time they do a programming round, they call me. There's been other ones like with other public libraries, and, there's like Virginia Co-op extensions that they do a long form 6-week financial planning kind of series. So I teach the investing one and the retirement one. So that's reoccurring. So that kind of stuff pops up. And then I continuously look for other women's entrepreneurial organizations. And, on my list for the week it's more like the month or 2 months, I try to reach out and do coffees with these kind of folks and ask if they can put me in touch with other people who are in the same field.
And it's the reason to have some sort of focus with your client base, right? Because if you work with individuals and families, how are you supposed to find speaking engagements targeting individuals and families, right? But because you can say entrepreneurial women, there are organizations dedicated to that group. And so it makes it a little easier, I guess, to filter which speaking engagements make sense for you and which ones don't. But what I would anticipate is, just like you said, as people see you speak, some of the folks in the audience may be in charge of programming for other similar organizations that they're also involved in, and word of mouth starts to build, and those speaking requests start to increase. And are you charging for those, or are you still doing those for free at this point?
Most of them are for free, but I do charge for some others. And so I'm trying to figure out how I can make that more of a focus in 2017, is to do more paid speaking engagements. But some of the early research that I found is that unless you have a book written, it's difficult to get a lot of those paid type speaking engagements. It's more difficult, I should say. But I'm kind of working on cracking that code a little bit. And I do want to write a book, but it's probably not going to be next year.
Yeah, we just went through that process ourselves, and it's a little bit daunting, but it's a very good point that once you're a published author, and I'll put air quotes around that, it suddenly commands this additional level of respect as a speaker, and they'll buy 400 copies of your book and pay you to come, whereas they weren't interested in paying you before. So that is an interesting point that breaking into the speaking circuit, it is a little easier if you have a book, if you can be a published author and the expert on something and be able to kind of hold that up. So I guess kind of as we're wrapping things up, before we wrap things up, I do one more question is, are you in a study group or have a mentorship type relationship? Have you found anything like that kind of in this first year of business for yourself?
Yeah, I actually have a couple of different study groups. So in DC, we have a pretty large group of XY planning members. So we get together roughly every other month. And a lot of it is very social. And we get together over lunch or drinks and talk. We talk business, but a lot of it's social too. And it's great because Michael Kitces is here in DC. So we get to see him frequently, which is wonderful. And then I also have a weekly study group of other XY planning members that I just recently started a few months ago. That has been pretty helpful as well.
Does the study group have a particular focus? Like all the advisors are focused on working with entrepreneurial women, or was it more just kind of a group of advisors that got along personality-wise? Yeah,
it was somewhat random, and that's been fine because we all have so many things that are common across businesses, regardless of niche, that we're all focused on different marketing efforts. We're all focused on, compliance things. We're all focused on our operations as it relates to onboarding clients. So I find it to be really useful. And I also find it really useful that we focus on our wins. So one of the things that I love doing just with myself is sending myself a weekly wins email to keep me focused on the positive. And we've started doing that with our study group, where we start every meeting off talking about our wins for the week. And I think that's a great way just to mentally focus on like the bigger picture of all the good things that are happening. Because it can be really easy to sometimes get frustrated that you lost a client or, that you didn't get this one client that you really wanted. That can sort of take over our brain power. But if we focus, make an effort to focus on these weekly wins, it kind of turns the mindset around a bit.
Absolutely. I can't wait to ask this question in a benchmarking survey to see if we can correlate success with study groups, because I do truly believe that folks in study groups have a higher chance of success because of things like that. Just think, it's hard to sit there when you're just by yourself and talk about your wins and email yourself. Not all of us have that kind of, I guess, intestinal fortitude to actually do that. But when you're in a group and you can encourage each other, it is amazing the power of the study group. So it's typically my number one recommendation for anybody that's doing anything in financial planning. It's find a study group, find a group of peers that you can support and that can support you, because it's amazing what that will do for your career. So, Cady, as we're sort of wrapping up, I'll ask you the final question, which is if you could go back to maybe the Cady that was looking at starting a financial planning firm or even further back, if there's one thing that you wish you could go back and tell yourself, one of the things that you wish you knew then that you know now, what do you think that one piece of advice would be?
This is a very good question. what my gut feeling is that I would have told myself to do this sooner, to start my business sooner. But then my brain is kicking in and saying, well, I don't know if you should have done this any sooner, because it's all about the collective experience that you've had and all those kinds of things. So I don't know. My gut and my mind are a little bit torn here, but starting my business has been really good for me. And so I think that I would have maybe told myself to start focusing on it sooner, maybe, and getting serious about it.
Fantastic. Well, Cady, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show today. We really do appreciate it.
Thanks, Alan.
Cady has just an awesome story, and it's one that I honestly hope resonates with younger female advisors out there who are wondering if starting a firm is in the cards. Cady is working towards building a successful business, working with clients she loves, working the schedule that makes sense for her lifestyle, all while doing work that she finds fulfilling, which is something I think we all aspire to. This month's episodes are brought to you by Financial Planners Assistance, providing compliance services to financial planners and other investment advisors since 1982. Financial Planners Assistance is a boutique consulting firm that provides the personalized compliance services firms are looking for. I actually personally worked with Financial Planners Assistance when launching my firm back in 2012, and I cannot say enough great things about their team and Jim Cullen, the owner. The awesome service and support I received was unparalleled, including going through an audit by the state of Wisconsin. Check them out at financialplannersassistance.com. Be sure to join our VIP community at xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP to hang out with other XYPN radio listeners, ask questions for future mailbag episodes with myself and Kitsis, and to finally find a community of like-minded financial advisors. Thanks so much for joining me today. We'll see you next time.
You're not alone, and you're not crazy. It's scary starting, building, and growing your own financial planning firm. And that's why we put together a free private community just for you, the Cutting Edge Financial Planner. Go to xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP or text XYPN Radio to 33344 and join a network of thousands ready to change the lives of Gen X and Gen Y clients.